Some places do not ask to be understood. They exist quietly without instruction, without explanation. You arrive there and notice that nothing is trying to happen. The moment does not present itself as important. It does not introduce meaning. It simply remains available, open in the same steady way it always has been. Attention slows naturally in a place like this, not because someone told it to slow down, and not because something unusual appeared. It slows because there is nothing pushing it forward. Nothing insists on the next step. The mind often expects movement, a direction, a purpose forming somewhere ahead. But here that expectation fades quickly. There is no signal telling the moment what it should become. The landscape remains still, and in that stillness, attention begins to soften. Thought continues to appear as it always does. A brief memory may pass through awareness. A quiet sentence may begin somewhere in the background of the mind. Sometimes the beginning of an idea forms without finishing itself. These thoughts are not blocked. They are simply not carried forward. Without urgency, they remain light. They pass through awareness the same way clouds pass through the sky, present for a moment and then gone again without leaving anything behind. The moment continues without effort. Breathing moves quietly in the background. The body remains at ease without adjusting itself for what might come next. Nothing here requires preparation. Time moves as it always does, yet it does not feel measured. There is no sense of counting minutes or noticing seconds passing by. Without expectation, time loses its pressure. Moments arrive and pass without collecting into something larger. They do not form a story. They do not build toward explanation. They simply appear, exist briefly, and continue into the next moment without resistance. Attention begins to notice how little effort is required for experience to continue. Usually the mind organizes what is happening. It labels, compares, explains. It tries to decide what matters and what does not. Here that habit loosens. Nothing asks to be interpreted. Nothing asks to be improved. Experience remains open. Awareness spreads gently across everything that is present. It does not narrow toward a single object. At the same time, it does not drift away. It simply remains available. The quiet quality of the moment becomes more noticeable, not because it is dramatic, but because nothing interrupts it. Even small sensations belong to the same openness. The movement of breath, the subtle presence of the body, the faint shifts of attention itself. None of these sensations demand focus. They exist together without hierarchy. Nothing stands at the center of experience. Nothing fades completely into the background. Everything shares the same quiet space. This equality creates a subtle balance, not a balance that needs to be maintained, but a balance that exists naturally when nothing is competing for importance. Thought returns briefly, a word, a fragment of memory, perhaps something from earlier in the day. But without urgency, the thought fades before it becomes significant. There is no need to push it away. There is no need to continue it. Experience continues quietly where it is. Breathing remains steady. The body does not prepare for interruption. Attention rests without effort. Even the idea of calm slowly becomes less noticeable. What once felt like quiet now simply feels ordinary. The moment does not present itself as something special. It does not ask to be remembered. It does not ask to be extended. It simply remains available. Time continues to move forward. Moments arrive and disappear in the same gentle rhythm. They do not accumulate into meaning. They do not demand explanation. They simply continue. If something were to change, it would belong here as easily as everything else. A thought could appear. A sound could arrive. Movement could happen in the body. None of it would interrupt what is present, because what is present does not depend on stillness. It does not depend on silence. It does not depend on anything remaining the same. Experience continues in the same open way, unstructured, unmeasured, undemanding. The ordinary quality of the moment remains untouched. Nothing marks it as important. Nothing frames it as meaningful. It simply continues, quiet and steady, exactly as it is. After some time, the moment no longer feels like something that began. It simply feels like what is already here. There is no clear transition between before and now. The quiet presence of the moment does not introduce itself as something new. It exists the same way the air exists around you, unnoticed until attention stops searching for something else. Awareness settles into that simplicity. At first, the mind may still expect movement. Somewhere in the background, there is a familiar habit of waiting for the next thing to appear. A subtle readiness remains, as if experience might suddenly ask for attention. But nothing asks. Nothing announces a change. The moment continues exactly as it is. Thought appears quietly again, a faint memory, a word that almost becomes a sentence, perhaps the beginning of a plan or a recollection from earlier in the day. For a brief moment it takes shape, and then it softens again before it can grow into something larger. Without urgency, thoughts remain light. They do not link together into longer chains. Each thought stands briefly on its own before fading back into the same open space where it appeared. There is no effort to silence them. There is also no effort to follow them. The moment remains steady. Breathing continues in the same natural rhythm. The body does not adjust itself or prepare for movement. Nothing in the moment suggests that something needs to happen next. Even time begins to feel less defined. Minutes pass, but they are not counted. The sense of moving from one moment toward another loses its importance. Experience does not feel like a sequence of events. It feels continuous. Moments appear and dissolve without forming a story. Attention begins to notice how little effort is required for the moment to continue. Normally, the mind organizes experience quickly. It explains what is happening, decides whether something is useful, and looks for meaning within it. Here that habit becomes unnecessary. Nothing asks to be interpreted. Nothing asks to be improved. Experience remains open. Awareness spreads gently across everything that is present. It does not tighten around a single object of focus, but it also does not drift away. It simply remains where it is. Everything shares the same quiet presence. The movement of breath, the subtle weight of the body, the quiet shifting of attention itself. None of these sensations demand importance. None of them ask to be named. Thought returns briefly once again, perhaps only a single word this time, or the faint image of a place. It appears for a moment and then fades before attention has time to examine it closely. Without momentum, it disappears naturally. Nothing depends on it. The mind begins to relax its need to shape the moment. Usually experience feels structured by intention. There are plans to consider, decisions to make, directions to follow. Here there is no direction. There is no task. Experience continues without needing to become anything else. Even the sense of calm begins to blend into the background. What once felt like quiet now simply feels ordinary. It no longer stands apart from the rest of experience. It simply belongs. Time continues to pass quietly. Moments arrive and leave without gathering into meaning. They do not point toward explanation. They do not create expectation. Each moment stands briefly on its own before dissolving into the next. Attention remains steady. There is no reason to hold the moment in place and no reason to move away from it. Without pressure, awareness rests naturally where it is. Breathing remains calm. The body remains relaxed. Thought continues to pass lightly through awareness. Nothing in the moment demands change. Nothing suggests that something should happen next. The mind no longer tries to evaluate the moment. Usually experience is compared against something else. Is this moment useful? Is it interesting? Does it lead somewhere important? Those questions lose their relevance here. There is nothing to measure, nothing to judge. Without comparison, tension has nowhere to grow. Experience remains open in the same quiet way. Thought may return again briefly. A faint idea appears, perhaps a memory of something unfinished. But without urgency, it cannot hold attention for long. It dissolves before becoming important. The moment continues, unstructured, unmeasured, undemanding. Breathing continues quietly. The body remains at ease. Awareness rests without effort. Nothing in the moment asks to be extended. Nothing suggests that something else should begin. The ordinary quality of experience remains untouched. Nothing marks it as special. Nothing frames it as meaningful. It simply continues, quiet and steady, exactly as it is. After a while, the moment feels even more ordinary. The quiet that once seemed noticeable becomes something that no longer stands out. It blends into everything else, the way background sounds blend into a room when nothing demands attention. Nothing here asks to be held. Nothing asks to be maintained. The moment continues without needing care. Awareness remains present in a simple way. It does not focus sharply on one thing, yet it does not drift away either. It rests lightly within the moment, allowing whatever appears to exist without interruption. Thought still appears from time to time. A small image may surface for a moment, or a quiet sentence may begin somewhere in the background of the mind. Sometimes it becomes a brief idea before fading again. Without urgency, thought cannot gather weight. It remains light. Each thought stands on its own for a moment before dissolving into the same open space where it appeared. Nothing carries it forward. There is no effort to stop it. There is also no effort to continue it. The moment remains steady. Breathing moves quietly in the background, unnoticed most of the time. The body rests in its natural posture without needing adjustment. Nothing prepares for interruption. Nothing anticipates what might happen next. Time passes quietly. Seconds move forward, but they do not feel measured. Without expectation, time becomes something gentle, something that flows without pressure. Moments arrive without announcing themselves. They pass without leaving a trace. Attention no longer searches the edges of experience. Earlier, there may have been a subtle habit of checking what might appear next. Something interesting could happen. Something new could begin. But that expectation slowly fades. There is nothing waiting to begin. nothing waiting to end. Experience simply continues where it is. The mind begins to notice how unnecessary effort has become. Usually attention moves quickly from one thing to another, organizing and interpreting everything it encounters. It decides what matters, what should be remembered, what should be ignored. Here that movement slows. Nothing asked to be interpreted, nothing asked to be improved. Experience remains open. Awareness spreads gently across the whole moment. It includes everything without emphasizing anything in particular. The movement of breath, the quiet presence of the body, the subtle shifts of attention itself. All of it exists within the same quiet space. Nothing stands above the rest. Nothing falls below it. This absence of hierarchy creates a quiet balance, not a balance that needs to be held together, but a balance that appears naturally when nothing competes for importance. Thought returns again briefly, perhaps a memory from earlier in the day, a word, a faint recognition of something familiar, but without urgency, it fades before becoming something larger. Nothing depends on it. Experience continues. Even the sense of calm becomes less noticeable. What once felt like quiet now simply feels normal. It does not stand apart from the rest of experience. It simply belongs to it. Time continues to pass quietly. Moments arrive and disappear without forming a story. They do not build toward explanation or meaning. They simply continue. Attention remains steady. There is no reason to hold the moment in place. There is no reason to leave it either. Without pressure, awareness rests naturally where it is. Breathing remains calm. The body remains relaxed. Thought continues to move lightly through awareness. Nothing in the moment demands change. Nothing suggests that something else should begin. The mind gradually stops measuring the moment. Usually experience is compared against something else. Is this useful? Is it meaningful? Does it lead somewhere important? Those questions fade. There is nothing to measure, nothing to evaluate. Without comparison, tension cannot grow. Experience remains open in the same quiet way. Thought may appear again, a brief idea, a fragment of memory, something that might have continued if attention had followed it. But attention does not follow. Without momentum, the thought dissolves easily. The moment continues, unstructured, unmeasured, undemanding. Breathing continues quietly. The body remains at ease. Awareness rests without effort. Nothing in the moment asks to be extended. Nothing suggests that something else should begin. The ordinary quality of experience remains untouched. Nothing marks it as special. Nothing frames it as meaningful. It simply continues, quiet and steady, exactly as it is. After some time, even the sense of stillness becomes less noticeable. What once felt like quiet now simply feels ordinary. The moment no longer appears different from any other moment. It continues in the same gentle way, without asking to be recognized. Attention rests naturally within it. There is no effort to stay here and no effort to move away. The mind no longer checks whether the moment is calm or meaningful. It simply remains where it is. Thought appears again, softly, a word, a memory. Perhaps the beginning of a sentence forming somewhere in the background. For a moment it seems like it might continue, but without urgency it fades again before becoming something larger. Nothing depends on it. Thought moves through awareness the way clouds move across the sky, present for a short while, and then gone without leaving anything behind. The moment remains steady, breathing continues quietly. The body remains relaxed without adjusting itself or preparing for movement. Nothing here suggests that something should happen next. There is no direction forming ahead. Time continues to pass, but its movement is gentle and almost unnoticed. Seconds move forward without pressure, without the sense that something must happen before they disappear. Moments arrive quietly. They pass just as quietly. They do not collect into a story. They do not gather into meaning. Each moment stands briefly on its own before giving way to the next. Attention no longer searches for significance. Earlier, there may have been a subtle habit of evaluating experience. The mind often asks whether something is useful or interesting, whether it leads somewhere meaningful. Here, those questions do not appear. There is nothing to evaluate, nothing to measure. Without comparison, tension cannot grow. Experience remains open. Awareness spreads gently across everything that is present. It does not narrow around a single object, yet it does not drift away either. Everything exists within the same quiet space: the movement of breath, the presence of the body, the faint shifting of attention itself. None of these sensations demand importance. None of them need to be explained. They simply exist together. This equality creates a quiet balance. Nothing stands above the rest. Nothing fades completely into the background. Everything shares the same gentle presence. Thought returns briefly again, perhaps a memory of something familiar, a place, a word, a fragment of an unfinished idea. But without urgency, it dissolves quickly. There is nothing holding it in place. Experience continues without interruption. The mind begins to notice how little effort is required for the moment to continue. Usually, experience feels guided by intention. Plans appear, decisions form, attention moves toward what seems important. Here, none of that movement is necessary. Nothing asks to be organized. Nothing asks to be improved. Experience unfolds naturally. Even the sense of calm becomes less noticeable over time. What once felt quiet now simply feels normal, as if nothing unusual ever happened. The moment no longer stands apart from the rest of life. It simply belongs to it. Time continues to pass. Moments arrive and disappear without leaving anything behind. They do not accumulate into something larger. They do not create a narrative. They simply continue. Attention remains steady. There is no need to hold the moment in place. There is no need to move away from it. Awareness rests exactly where it is. Breathing continues. The body remains at ease. Thought moves lightly through awareness, appearing and fading without urgency. Nothing in the moment demands change. Nothing suggests that something else should begin. Experience remains open, unstructured, unmeasured, undemanding. The ordinary quality of the moment remains untouched. Nothing marks it as important. Nothing frames it as meaningful. It simply continues in the same quiet way. Breathing moves gently, attention remains present, and the moment continues exactly as it is. Eventually, the moment feels completely ordinary. The quiet that once seemed noticeable is no longer something the mind points to. It has blended into the background of experience so fully that it is simply part of everything else. Attention no longer checks the atmosphere of the moment. There is no quiet question asking whether this state is calm enough or whether it should continue. The mind has stopped measuring what is happening. Experience continues without commentary. Thought still appears from time to time. A faint memory may surface for a moment, or a brief idea may begin somewhere in the background of the mind. Occasionally, a word forms quietly before fading again. These thoughts arrive lightly. Without urgency, they do not remain long. They pass through awareness and disappear without leaving a trace behind them. Nothing holds them in place, and nothing carries them forward. The moment remains steady. Breathing continues quietly in the background. The body rests naturally without adjusting itself. There is no preparation for movement and no anticipation of interruption. Everything feels unforced. Time moves in the same quiet way. Seconds pass, but they are not counted. There is no awareness of waiting for something to happen, and no sense that something should already have happened. Without expectation, time loses its pressure. Moments appear and fade without forming a narrative. They do not build toward explanation. They do not gather into meaning. Each moment exists briefly before giving way to the next. Attention rests gently within this flow. There is no need to direct it. There is no need to keep it still. Awareness simply remains available. The movement of breath continues. The subtle presence of the body remains steady. Even the faint shifts of attention are included in the same quiet space. Nothing stands above the rest. Nothing fades completely into the background. Everything shares the same openness. Thought appears again, perhaps only a fragment of a sentence this time, a word, a small memory from earlier in the day. It appears briefly and dissolves before becoming significant. Without urgency, the mind has little reason to continue shaping the moment. Usually, attention organizes experience quickly. It evaluates what is happening and decides whether something is useful or important. Here, that habit relaxes. Nothing asks to be interpreted. Nothing asks to be improved. Experience remains open. Even the sense of calm becomes less noticeable. What once felt like quiet now simply feels natural. It no longer stands apart from the rest of experience. It simply belongs to it. The moment continues without needing to be recognized. Breathing remains steady. The body remains at ease. Thought continues to appear lightly and disappear again. Nothing in the moment asks for attention. Nothing demands change. Time continues to pass quietly. Moments arrive and dissolve without leaving anything behind. They do not collect into a larger story, and they do not point toward any particular outcome. They simply continue. Attention remains steady within the moment. There is no reason to hold the moment in place. There is no reason to move away from it either. Awareness rests where it is. Thought may appear once again. A brief recognition of something familiar, a place, a person, a faint recollection that lasts only a moment before fading again. Without momentum, it disappears easily. Experience continues. Unstructured, unmeasured, undemanding. The ordinary quality of the moment becomes clearer. Nothing marks it as important. Nothing frames it as meaningful. It simply exists. Even the idea of maintaining the moment disappears. There is nothing to maintain. The moment does not depend on effort or attention in order to continue. It simply continues. If something were to change, it would belong here just as easily as everything else. A sound could appear, a thought could return more clearly, or the body could shift slightly. None of it would interrupt what is present, because what is present does not depend on stillness. It does not depend on silence. It does not depend on anything remaining the same. Experience remains open. Thought moves lightly through awareness. Breathing continues in its quiet rhythm. Time passes without pressure. Nothing in the moment asks to be extended. Nothing suggests that something else should begin. The ordinary nature of experience remains untouched, unmarked, undemanding, simply present. And the moment continues in the same quiet way it always has, without needing to become anything more.